You're listening to Where the World Comes to Talk.
This is Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopowicz. This week's guest is William W. Freeling, author of a book 40 years in the making now, The Road to Disunion, Volume 2, Secessionists Triumphant. It's a book that stands on its head almost all we know about the start of the Civil War. We'll find out how the war really began from our guest today, Bill Freeling, on Civil War Talk Radio.
Have you let your website go stale?
Wish you didn't have to wait for your web developer to return your call when you want to update content?
You don't have to.
Now you can easily and instantly manage your own website content using affordable Avalar technology.
Avalar is a website development and hosting company that provides turnkey internet solutions for companies like yours that need to stay focused on core business.
Avalar gives you the power to control your website and make updates and additions in real time without having to learn HTML or other complicated programming tools.
Websites powered by Avalar feature capabilities that attract more customers and enhance relationships with existing customers.
Avalar offers a multitude of leading-edge solutions, including lead generation and referral tracking, shopping carts and payment processing, membership management, and search engine optimization, to name a few.
Take advantage of the full power of the Internet using Avalar technology at www.avalar.com.
That's AVALAR.com.
World Talk Radio, bringing the world to you.
Welcome to Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopowicz, coming to you from my office here on the campus of East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina, on a beautiful spring day in 2007. Celebrating happy news because the chancellor of the university has taken the time personally to review my progress. Well, actually, I'm sure he just looked at somebody else's report, but has sent yet another of the large string of letters one gets on the process toward tenure from the department and the dean and the provost and the chancellor and the et cetera. And I'm winding my way there so that within perhaps even a few weeks, when this is approved by the Board of Trustees, and I am actually a tenured professor, I can just stop working forever. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. It's too soon. They haven't approved it yet. But eventually, we're almost there. But enough about me. What do you think of my course toward tenure? All right, the old jokes are the best jokes. Enough of that. Legal disclosure, as always. It's my show, my opinions, those of the guest, and not those of the East Carolina University or the University of North Carolina system or anybody else. It's just us. And opinions we should probably have today, as we have a book of, I would say, extraordinary interest. The books we talk about in this show each week I find interesting. I hope you, the listeners, do too. But this week we have a book that really demands to be read. Everyone must, when it's in their bookstores, go out and get a copy and read it for themselves and think about it and argue with it. But today we get to talk with the author of it, William W. Freeling, who has produced a book called The Road to Disunion, Volume 2, Secessionists Triumphant. Bill, are you there?
Jerry, and thanks so much for having me on. And let me say just a word about what you just said.
Sure.
I know you're just kidding when you say that the awarding of tenure ends a career, because the award of tenure, as we both know, just begins one. And actually, the harder, the more you go on in the professional world, the more intoxicating it becomes, and you just keep going, and it gets more and more exciting. And tenure is just the beginning of many wonderful years.
Well, that's wonderful to hear, and I don't doubt that for a second. When the people I know who've been in this game longer than I have, who have been tenured in many cases for a long time, all the ones I know and talk to on this show and talk to at meetings are, as you say, almost intoxicated with the excitement of what we do. To be able to study and teach and write and get paid for it is just a marvelous thing.
Well, you're so right, and I actually started this book when I was just at your stage, that is to say, it just gotten tenure. And here it's 40 years later, and I've finally written it. So that tells you a little bit about how long the process takes and how exciting it is.
Well, I've got a manuscript that was due like a month ago. I'm going to tell my editor, hey, Bill Freeling took 40 years. You can relax.
That's a good answer.
I'll see if that works. Well, when I say 40 years, your book, The Road to Disunion, Volume 1, did come out some time ago. Had you always planned on this second volume as part of the project?
No, I'd originally planned actually to write, back when I was just getting tenure, a book paralleling Kenneth Stamp's book on the secession crisis in the North. He calls his book "And the War Came." It's a wonderful book for your listeners to read. And there's never been a parallel book on the South, on the secession crisis in the South, and I thought I was going to write one. And I thought it would be about 300 pages long, and it'd take about 5 years to write it. And then I discovered that there were just so many mysteries about secession that I couldn't explain if I just started in 1861, that I started working my way backward. And I kept working backward and backward until I got all the way to 1776. And then I began to find the answers I was looking for. And the first volume takes my explanation of the answers up to 1854, and then there's a second volume that I've just completed and has just been published, which takes the story right through the firing on Fort Sumter.
And I want to talk to you a lot about that this afternoon. Let me just get a bit of background here. You sent me a very entertaining interview you had with the Southern Historian Journal, and I made a point after looking at the first page to not read the rest of it because I like to ask questions I don't know the answers to. It's more fun that way for all of us.
They're the best questions.
But tell us about your background educationally and your interest in the Civil War era.
Well, sure. I grew up in Chicago and went to Harvard, and there took a course with Paul Buck, who was an old Southern boy who espoused in his lectures the old litany about the South, that slavery was a wonderful institution, the blacks were happy, the abolitionists were demon, the Civil War was a great and unnecessary tragedy, Reconstruction was a horror, the people who redeemed the South were wonderful, and so on. And I didn't really know enough to know what was wrong with that as a Harvard undergraduate, but it smelled sort of fishy to me. And then Kenneth Stamp came along and gave some guest lectures. I think he was probably being considered for an appointment at Harvard. He was then teaching at Berkeley, always taught at Berkeley. And Stamp told me just the opposite. Stamp in his lectures gave just the opposite viewpoint, that there was things seriously wrong with slavery, that blacks often resisted, just the absolute reverse of what I'd heard from Paul Buck, and it was just very, very exciting. And I resolved that I wanted to study this subject, and I wanted to study under Kenneth Stamp. So I went off to Berkeley, where I got my PhD.
So it's hard to imagine that that Professor Buck was teaching this sort of thing at Harvard, no less.
Yeah, it's very interesting that was going on. One of my friends, and I'm just a marvelous historian, David Bryan Davis, writes about exactly the same experience. We hadn't talked to each other when we both wrote about it, but he too, Mr. Davis, who taught at Yale too, remarks on how incredible it was that in the Harvard of the 1950s, this doctrine was still very, very strong.
Wow. Well, and it persists even in sort of the general culture, the kind of gone with the wind image of the Old South, the happy slaves, the cruel Reconstruction.
Well, it does persist, and you're quite right about that. And what's fascinating to me is that it doesn't very much persist among the Southern historians. The meeting of the Southern Historical Association, the annual meeting in November, used to be dominated by old boys like Paul Buck. And when you go now, it's just an entirely different atmosphere, and young Southern historians are just couldn't be more with it, with understanding all the complexities of the South. So the professional historians have changed, but the culture, as you say, in some quarters lags behind.
It may be a generation before teaching and scholarship eventually percolates to sort of general understanding.
That's a shrewd way to put it, and I think that often happens.
Now, I did glance at one question that you were asked in this written interview, and I wanted to ask you about it here. The relationship between writing and teaching as a professor, as a scholar, how does that work for you?
Well, it doesn't work the way it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be that the teaching enormously stimulates the research, and the research enormously stimulates the teaching, but it never worked that way for me. I loved both these roles. I adored being a teacher, and I adore writing books, but they got in each other's way for me. And I think it's partly because I just never was bright enough to do both things at once well. When I concentrated on teaching, I'd concentrate on that, and I'd lose the thread of what I was writing. And then when I was writing, I'd concentrate on that, and I'd lose the thread of what I was teaching. And I think that by far my most successful years of writing have been since I retired from teaching, just because I can now, in a single-minded way, devote myself to writing.
Well, I'm thrilled to hear that, because I think I share that reluctance to do multitasking. I'd rather do one thing at a time, and I find very much the same thing when teaching a large class load. I throw myself into it. If I'm writing, it's throw myself into that. But it's hard to do both. But you've certainly succeeded in terms of writing with this current book. And let me turn to that. The Road to Disunion, Volume 2, where, as you say, takes up the story in 1854. You start by talking about the paradigm way of teaching about the approach to secession. You've got the South before, let's say, 1830, 1831, generally reluctant to maintain slavery. It's what Jefferson called a wolf by the ears. You don't want to hold it, don't want to let it go. Suddenly, Nat Turner rebels. Garrison starts publishing The Liberator, and the South, as one, says, no, this is a positive good. We wish to retain slavery. And
no, it's precisely that notion that caused me to have to take the story back to from 1860 back to 1832. What I found the people constantly saying in 1860, Jerry, was, we're afraid there are a whole bunch of Southerners who are not in favor of keeping slavery and can be worked on by Abraham Lincoln and his party if Abraham Lincoln builds a Southern Republican Party. That made no sense to me in view of what I had been taught and what we'd all been taught, that is to say that the South in by 1835 had thoroughly and unanimously decided that slavery was a good. That was the biggest reason why I suddenly realized I couldn't start in 1860. I had to find out why people thought in 1860 that the South was still a very divided culture. And the more I went back, the more I found that there were indeed deep divisions in the South that were never papered over, that never could be papered over, and particularly between what I call the border South and what I call the lower South. By the border South, I mean the South closest to the north, and by the lower South, I mean the South closest to the Gulf of Mexico. And those two worlds are just different worlds, and they never do accept the same ideology. And there thus remains reason for those in the lower South to be suspicious of those in the border South.
So you got two Souths at least, the lower South and the border South that don't.
Yeah, and there are others, and then there's the middle South, which is right between them. And I think of it in easy terms this way, that after Lincoln was elected, the lower South seceded, but neither the middle South nor the border South did, and that those middle South and border South areas contain 2/3 of the Southerners, which means that 2/3 of the Southerners did not think Lincoln's election justified disunion. But when the war starts, the middle South secedes, but the border South never secedes and throws its resources largely into the hands of the Union Army. And in another book that I've written, I argue that has a lot to do with the Union victory.
So the South is hardly this monolith of pro-slavery and pro-secession sentiment.
Exactly, and in fact, the secessionists right after Lincoln's election are a minority, and my greatest task is to explain how a minority could control the majoritarian process, and that takes some doing.
Well, that's the theme that runs through this whole book, this discussion of minorities and majorities. We live in a Republican, small r society that where the elected representatives make the laws, and that's supposed to be the case in the 1850s, but somehow, you argue that's not what happens. Minorities drive the process.
That's right.
Who are the minorities?
That is what I think, and by the way, that is what the majority North thought in the 1850s, which had a lot to do with Lincoln's election. Look, when you look at the politics of the 1850s, it's amazing how much the South controls the whole process of decision. The South, which is a minority section, succeeds in getting the Fugitive Slave Law. The South, which is a minority section, succeeds in getting the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The South comes within a really fascinating inch of forcing Kansas to be admitted as an enslaved state. The South has the minority South has a majority on the Supreme Court and gets the Dred Scott decision through. So you have a constant process of the minority section controlling the Union. And I think it's that process that eventually just gets on Northerners' nerves and makes them determined to turn the majority rules system into a system where the majority will indeed rule. And that is, I think, Lincoln's biggest campaign theme in the 1860 presidential campaign. Not to abolish slavery, but to abolish the minority slave power's control over the majority.
Well, that does make sense, because that also accounts for the generally racist attitudes of Northern voters are such that even those who are anti-slavery aren't necessarily sympathetic to the slaves.
Yeah, you put your finger on what I think is just a major theme, not only in the history of the coming of the Civil War, but also in American history. And one of the reasons why American history is so important to study by our citizens today, it is certainly not just the South that is prejudiced against blacks. The North also has a slavery system before the American Revolution, and indeed until the 1820s in the most enslaved states like New York and Pennsylvania. And the North has a serious system of segregation long before the South does for free blacks. And the North is a strongly anti-black culture with really severe black codes, and in some states refusal to allow blacks to come into the state. So racism is not a Southern disease. Racism is a national disease. And it's one of the reasons why studying the Civil War is so fascinating, because despite the fact that the average Northerner doesn't like blacks and really doesn't wish to have blacks freed if they're going to come north, still gets moved by the process of history to eventually become an emancipating society. And how you get from a racist society to an emancipating society is a fascinating process.
It sounds like another book in that one.
Well, you can write that one.
Now, you talk about the South exerting its minority control, and the mind immediately leaps to the 3/5 clause that gives Southern whites more voting power than Northern whites. But that can't be the whole answer. How does a minority South get all those laws passed, Fugitive Slave Act, Kansas, Nebraska, and so on?
You're very shrewd to say that the 3/5 clause has a lot to do with it. But as you say, it doesn't have anything to do with it, doesn't have everything to do with it, and I would say it doesn't have most to do with it. I think it's the two-party system that has most to do with it. The Democratic Party before the Civil War is the nation's majority party. That is to say, more congressmen, more Supreme Court judges, more presidents are Democrats before the Civil War. Andrew Jackson and his Democratic Party have had a mammoth influence, and although there's some Whig victories, they usually win. But inside that majority party, the South has far more power. The South gives far more senators and far more representatives and far more votes proportionally to that majority party than the North does. So you have the minority section in control of the majority party, and that leverage enables the Southern-dominated Democratic Party to pass all the laws that we've discussed.
So without having the numbers, they have this extraordinary leverage.
They have leverage, and whenever you study politics, it's not necessarily numbers, it's leverage that counts. We see this all the time in Congress now. Certain congressmen have much more power than they ought to have, considering what a tiny state they come from, but they're able to manipulate the system in a way that gives them power. The study of politics is a study of power, and it's not necessarily the same at all as the study of who has the most votes.
Interesting. Well, let's take a short break. We'll come back in just a moment. We're talking today with Bill Freeling, author of The Road to Disunion, Volume 2, and many other books. We'll come right back in just a moment on Civil War Talk Radio.
World Talk Radio.
Product of impersonal forces and events. But some historians would say sometimes it's a matter of individuals, personalities, railroad timetables, and other details. We'll find out the view of Bill Freeling on this curious question when we return on Civil War Talk Radio.
You got a small business? Well, then you know how tough it can be. Marketing, finding new customers, and especially just staying focused on the day-to-day details of running your business. Well, even though my business was doing okay, it wasn't where I knew it could be. I was getting a bit discouraged. Then I heard about this little book called Growing Your Business by Mark LeBlanc. Wow, I still can't figure out how such a small book could make such a big difference in my business. It only took about an hour to read, and the things I learned, well, all I can say is I'll be using Mark's ideas for a long time to come. Why? Because they work. I learned how to really focus on what I need to do to attract more customers and how to be more successful by creating a plan for generating more business. I guess that's why Mark named his website smallbusinesssuccess.com. Clever, huh? Small Business Success. That's it. If you want to be more successful with your business, and who doesn't, you should check out Mark LeBlanc's website at smallbusinesssuccess.com. You'll find Mark's books and lots of other resources for growing your business. smallbusinesssuccess.com.
World Talk Radio, bringing the world to you.
Welcome back to Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopovich, talking today with William W. Freeling, author of new book, The Road to Disunion, Volume 2, Secessionists Triumphant. It's a book that takes the story of secession from Dr. Freeling's first volume, which goes up to 1854, and this one takes the story from the Kansas-Nebraska Act 1854 to the firing on Fort Sumter and the secession of the Confederate States. Bill, in our first section, we talked a bit about how the South was a minority section in terms of numbers before the Civil War, and yet dominated the federal government through much of the 1850s. You carry that theme through this book, this minority control in what seems to be a democratic republic, in a number of ways. For example, within the South itself, non-slaveholders outnumber slaveholders considerably, yet the minority drives the agenda. How did that happen?
That's one of the great questions in Southern history, and I would expect a historian as good as you to answer. And it's not the easiest question to answer for the simple reason of sources. We have mammoth sources from the wealthy, from the slaveholders. They stuffed them in attics, they gave them to libraries, and the problem is whether one can find the time to read everything that the slaveholders wrote. On the other hand, there is extremely little writing survives of non-slaveholders. There are very few letters, there are very few diaries, and to get at their viewpoint, one is often guessing more than one would like to. It's rather like studying the institution of slavery, where you have mammoth evidence from the slaveholders, but scanty evidence from the slaves, and you have to guess often about the slave's viewpoint. But insofar as I can guess about the non-slaveholders' viewpoint. I make a sharp distinction between non-slaveholders that live in areas with lots of slaves and lots of slaveholders, and non-slaveholders who live in areas with scarcely any slaveholders. And in order to make that distinction clear, I like to divide the South between the Black Belt South and the White Belt South. Well, everybody's heard of the Black Belt South and knows what it means. It means an area black with slaves. But the White Belt South consumes an equal amount of geographic area and has as many whites living in it, but the belt of the South with very few slaves. In the belt of the South that's black with slaves, I think that non-slaveholders have some real stakes in slavery. Racial stakes in keeping blacks under control, and even economic stakes in making sure that blacks don't compete with them. We used to say that the non-slaveholders had a stake in buying slaves themselves someday, but I'm dubious about that because the price of slaves went so high in the 1850s, way beyond what most non-slaveholders could pay for it. But non-slaveholders did have a racial stake in keeping blacks under control, and they hated blacks, and they were delighted to serve on patrols which kept blacks under control. In a certain sense, they were slaveholders, at least psychologically, because they were responsible for patrolling the area and making sure that blacks were home at night and in their plantations. So in that Black Belt South, I think there is a stake of the non-slaveholders in slavery. I can't prove that because there isn't the evidence. I just strongly suspect it from all kinds of hints. On the other hand, in the White Belt South, where there aren't very many blacks, the possibilities of turning against slavery seem to me to be much greater, and that is exactly what the slaveholders were worried about.
So places like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, that are slave states, but with much smaller percentages of slaves.
Yeah,
a very different attitude there.
Exactly, much smaller percentage of slaves, and this is, I think, the crucial thing, Jerry. Most smaller percentages of black belt neighborhoods. It wasn't just that you have fewer slaves. It was also that many neighborhoods, many areas didn't even see a slave. And there you have an entirely different psychology, and I think a psychology much closer to the racist North's psychology. That is to say, we're glad we don't have blacks here, and we don't really care very much about slavery as long as the slaves don't come here.
Well, there's a marvelous map on page 66 of the book, your map of the state of Missouri, and it shows that there's literally a black belt running along the Missouri River where slavery is concentrated in that state. And the suggestion is the rest of the state is largely a very big white majority.
Which indeed it is, and that white majority is getting larger. Blacks are being sold down south from Missouri. Whites are pouring in to take their place, and the percentage of blacks is dropping. And here again, what I think is really important is that the percentage of neighborhoods that have blacks is dropping. And that map, I think, shows beautifully, and you could do the same map of any border South state, how small a percentage of the geographic area has very many slaves in it. And by the way, since you mentioned the maps, I think the maps in this book are marvelous. They were drawn for me by a California cartologist named can't think of his name at the moment. But anyway, he did a beautiful job. David Fuller's his name. He did a beautiful job on my maps. And one of the things I came away thinking is that if authors had more to do with having the maps drawn for their books, the maps would be better for the readers.
Well, I think that's absolutely true, and these maps really are good. There are a series of them, and each one is specific to the point you're trying to make in the text. They're not just space fillers or maps of things we already have in our collections.
And if you'll let me talk for just a second, Jerry, about another thing that I think is very important in the book is the photographs. I feel that photographs are just absolutely crucial for helping readers understand the text. And some of the photographs in this book are just incredible photographs, some of them never published before. And they illustrate abstract points so that you read about a certain person and then you see that person. And when you see it visually in a really sharp picture, it makes all the difference in understanding how a man operates.
It does, and if certainly maybe the best example in the book on page 392 I'm looking at is the photograph of John Townsend, whom I had never really heard of, I don't even think, a member of the Secession Association in 1860. And this photograph, it's too bad we're on an audio medium here, but listeners, you've got to buy the book just for the photograph. This South Carolinian is posed in a way that the picture is incredibly sharp, incredibly detailed. Even after being reproduced in the book, you can see so much more than in many modern photographs. The pose uses props, classical Greek column, books to tell us something about the person. But the personality, it just exudes from his posture, from his face. I cannot endorse the photographs highly enough. You're absolutely right about that.
I'm so glad that you like the picture of John Townsend. It to me tells almost the whole story of how extremely conservative reactionaries in Charleston led this revolution, and why only such people could ever get such a reactionary state out of the Union. And the picture has never been published before, and I was just absolutely ecstatic when I found it.
No, it is a great picture, and there are pictures like that throughout that really tell us something, and the captions help bring that alive, too. It's always...
Oh, I love you for saying that, Jerry. And another picture that I think is just sensational is a picture of Alexander Stephens. One of my points is that the Unionists had real trouble being active and active and as hard driving as the secessionists. And you see that when you see this picture of Alexander Stephens, who's literally lying down on his hand in the picture and is so passive and he's so tormented. And you can see that this is not a man that's going to be actively and fighting for a cause. And that lack of active fighting has a lot to do with the Unionists losing, I think. When you see it all in a picture, it's so wonderful.
It is. These pictures are worth the proverbial 1,000 words and then some. They're a strong part of the book. We were talking about the white belt, and you pointed out that people in these states in the upper South, in Missouri and in Maryland and Kentucky, you said slaves are leaving. They're being sent down the river, sold at a profit. Their labor is being replaced by immigrant laborers moving in. And I believe your book says that in the state of Maryland, by the time of the Civil War, the free black population outnumbers the enslaved population.
Yeah, isn't that a fascinating process? We think of the South as being different from the Caribbean because the South had an entirely black and an entirely black slave and entirely white population, two races, two classes, etc. We think of the Caribbean as having three classes: free blacks, slaves, and whites, and thus we think of Caribbean slavery as being very different. But in fact, in 2 of the 13 slave states, half the blacks or more were freed, half of them in Maryland, 80% of them in Delaware. And when you look at that kind of statistic, you can see why people in the Deep South, where none of that, where very little of that manumission has taken place, are trembling about what's going on up in the border South.
So slavery is really eroding in Missouri and Maryland.
Yeah, you have to be careful when you say that because it's eroding only very slowly. And in my own judgment, I don't know how you feel about it, it would have taken another 50 years for it to erode entirely. I liken the situation to the situation in the border north, where it takes 50 years for New York to abolish slavery, and it takes 50 years for Pennsylvania to abolish slavery. We don't think about it that way. We think the North abolished slavery right after the American Revolution, but it didn't. It was a very slow process, and I feel that it would have taken that same kind of slow process for slavery to evolve out of these white belts.
And yet, even though it's taking place so slowly, it is very upsetting to the Deep South, to the lower South, that this erosion of the periphery seems to spark a lot of the political agitation that they
exactly. And the big fear is that it can be accelerated, that if you just let it alone and let it evolve slowly, it will evolve slowly, but that slow process can be sped up under the right circumstances. And the right circumstances include, as the lower South sees it, successful politicians being able to agitate in the white belt areas for office, and thereby arousing the non-slaveholders. Everything is going to go slowly as long as there isn't agitation, but the minute there's agitation, this is the way the Lower South secessionists see it, the minute there's agitation, that process may speed up.
And it's that attempt to suppress the agitation that in turn angers the North.
That's exactly the point. And if you look at it a little bit more at large, the ultimate attempt to stop the agitation is secession itself, which breaks up the white democracy, which I think has a lot to do with why the North wants to fight a civil war in order to keep white democracy together. So this process throughout the 1850s of saving majority rule from the South becomes a climactic process of saving majority rule from the Southern secessionists.
Now, I mentioned in the break that some people argue big impersonal forces control history. You make a point that sometimes it comes down to the individual or even the odd coincidence, and you tell a very interesting story about the actual moment of secession in South Carolina and what that has to do with railroad timetables.
Before I tell that story, let me preface it by saying that this is a very difficult problem for an historian, because I do think that coincidences have a very important short-term effect on a process, but the long-term trends that have been part of the American Republic from the beginning are going to continue. So it's not that I think that if there only hadn't been a railroad that we never would have had a civil war. It's that I think that if we hadn't had this incredible railroad coincidence, everything would have worked out differently, and just might have, and civil war just might have been delayed. These coincidences are not the only thing involved, and there's all kinds of more fundamental and basic forces. But I'm just fascinated by the way coincidences, quirks, personalities can at least temporarily deflect an historical process.
In the case of South Carolina, after the election of Lincoln, you explained very clearly, in a way that I had never really grasped before, why so many South Carolinians were willing to take the leap into secession before Lincoln's even taken office. The common question I get from students, well, you mean he hadn't done anything yet? No, he's not even in office.
Well, that shows how smart your students are.
They're good.
He hasn't done anything, and that is the cardinal argument of most Southerners. He's constitutionally elected. He hasn't done anything. He doesn't have a majority in Congress. He doesn't have a majority in the Supreme Court. And he's willing to offer this constitutional amendment, which I think is just fascinating, in his inaugural address, which forever keeps federal hands off slavery and is considered an unamendable constitutional amendment. So why is this man dangerous, and why should we risk slavery in a civil war before we find out whether he's going to be dangerous? It's a very powerful argument that the Unionists have, and I think that's why they're in a majority in the South.
But you address that in one word, which is patronage. That's what seems to most threaten the right. Thought of Lincoln appointing Republican postmasters. Right.
Well, that's what comes through most strongly in the sources, and I repeat that was a very surprising thing to me way back when I first got tenure. The people would worry that Lincoln would use a political party in the process of giving tenure to build a Southern Republican Party in the South, and that Southern Republican Party, not a Northern Republican Party, but a Southern Republican Party, would eventually agitate against slavery. And that is the major argument for those against those who say Lincoln can't do anything. Yes, he can do something. He can build a political party in the South with his patronage position, and that political party can agitate against slavery where slavery is in a weaker state. And that's what the South Carolinians are afraid of. Their problem, as you pointed out before, and I want to get back to your excellent point, is that they're in a minority. And the secessionists are in a position of feeling very strongly that slavery is in danger, but they don't have a majority with them. So the problem is to find out some kind of way that a minority can control the process. And their nightmare is the calling of a Southern Convention. Because if a Southern Convention is called after Lincoln is elected to decide what the South will do, the majority of the Southerners can control that convention and can essentially vote not to secede, to recommend back to their states not to secede, and put a real wet blanket on secession. So what the South Carolinians are determined to do is to abort any chance that there will be a Southern Convention. And so much of what they do is an attempt at that abortion, an attempt at that precluding the majority from getting an institution, the Southern Convention, that they can control. And the best way to stop that majority process in a Southern Convention is for one state to secede. And that one state is going to be South Carolina. And the problem is that the South Carolinians are scared to death to try it, partly because, as I said before when we talked about John Townsend, they're such reactionaries, such cautious revolutionaries, that they're afraid that they're going to be stuck out on a limb all by themselves. So the beginning of secession is very much a process of these South Carolinians trying to get up the nerve to do what they think they must do, which is secede by themselves first and alone before any of the other states can get together and call a Southern Convention.
Well, Bill, we're going to take a break right here on the very precipice of secession and take a short break. We'll come back in just a moment and find out what gives the South Carolinians the nerve to go over the edge and push their state into secession and precipitate a civil war. We'll find that out when we return on Civil War Talk Radio.
World Talk Radio.
No state in 1860 was more conservative than South Carolina, and no part of South Carolina more conservative or reactionary than the Low Country planters, and yet they are the ones who precipitate the Revolution of '61. How did that happen? We'll find out when we come back on Civil War Talk Radio.
It's the one level playing field in business, the Internet. It's where an artisan working out of a small shop can look bigger than a multinational corporation. But to achieve this level of visibility, your company's website needs a developer who knows the net and how to make it work. Your company needs Appsio. Appsio's success comes from producing websites that reflect the attitudes and uniqueness of their respective organizations. Make a great first impression on the web. Choose Appsio, APSYO. For more info, visit www.appsio.com.
You're listening to World Talk Radio, where the world comes to talk.
Welcome back to Civil War Talk Radio. Our guest today is Bill Freeling, author of The Road to Disunion, Volume 2, Secessionists Triumphant, 1854 to 1861. Don't let the long and maybe a little academic-sounding name of the book throw you. It is a fascinating read that will give you a new perspective on the coming of the Civil War. In our last segment, we brought ourselves to a cliffhanger ending with South Carolina considering secession after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, but hesitating. This is the state that almost seceded in the nullification crisis and thought about it in 1850, and each time they've stepped back, they're poised on the brink again in 1860. What's going to happen this time? Why is it different?
You set up the question so beautifully. Let me say that on November 9th, which is 3 days after Lincoln is elected, the South Carolina Senate votes 44-1 to delay a secession convention and thus possibly allow a Southern Convention to be held. And on November 10th, the same body, 24 hours later, votes unanimously to speed up secession and to go ahead with instant disunion. And that 24-hour period is absolutely fascinating. And all the history that I've written from the South, from the American Revolution to Lincoln's election, cannot get me from November 9th, when South Carolina stopped, to November 10th, when they go ahead. And a great problem for me was to try to figure out what happened in that 24 hours that gave these aristocrats the nerve to try what they would not try a day earlier. And the answer turned out to be a railroad. The coincidence of when a railroad was completed. There was the erection of the Charleston to Savannah Railroad in the 1850s. It happened to be finished on October 26, 1860. Could have been completed in September. It could have been completed in December. It just happened to be finished on October 26th. And on November 3rd, there happened to be a celebration of that railroad in Savannah. And the people there arranged for another celebration on November 9th, precisely the evening after South Carolina had voted to delay. That meeting could have been scheduled any old time, but it happened to be scheduled when nobody knew secession was going to be in trouble on November 9th. And lo and behold, in Charleston to celebrate were some Georgians who were very, very persuasive to South Carolinians. One of them is a man named Francis Bartow, who is one of the incredible figures in this book. Bartow is an American nationalist. He's married to John Berrien's daughter. John Berrien had been the most important American nationalist in Whig politics in the 1850s in the South. Francis Bartow was an equally committed nationalist. He hated the idea of disunion, but he gets up at this meeting in Charleston and says that if you secede, we're not going to have any choice but to go along with you, because we cannot have a nation of South Carolina on one side of the Savannah River and a nation of America on the other side of the Savannah River with Georgia a part of it. We've got to be part of the same nation. So he says, in effect, to these Charlestonians, please don't secede, but if you do, we're going to have to go along with you. And several other Georgians say the same thing, and there's an immense cheer that goes up, because it seems to the Charlestonians that Georgia has pledged that they will go along, and if Georgia will go along, many other lower South states will. And a telegram is sent to Columbia, and a train is sent to Columbia the next day, and the next day, with this news in their pocket, the secessionists win in South Carolina, and the whole final process of secession gets underway. If that railroad had been completed on another day, and if that railroad celebration had been scheduled for another day, none of this could have happened. So in the very short term, a coincidence like this can make a huge difference.
And something that struck me as I was reading that was the analogy you drew between South Carolina's active secession, going from not wanting to do it or not sure about doing it, ready to put it off, maybe yes, maybe no. But when it happens, it's with this rush of enthusiasm. And you draw an analogy to the actions of Preston Brooks and Charles Sumner.
I'm so glad you noticed that, Jerry, because that's a very important point to me. Preston Brooks, in a very famous assault on Charles Sumner in 1856 in the United States Senate, had been outraged by what Sumner said in his speech, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. What Sumner of Massachusetts had said in his speech about the South and about a relative of Preston Brooks. And he was determined to avenge that insult. But he has a lot of trouble getting up the nerve to avenge the insult, and we watch him staggering around for days trying to figure out how he's going to get at the stronger Sumner, how he's ever going to assault him. And finally, he rushes up to Sumner and starts beating him, and when he starts beating him, he just can't stop. He's so exhilarated by overcoming his own uncertainty that he just keeps whipping and whipping and whipping Sumner, and makes Sumner a much greater martyr than he need have been. And exactly the same thing happens in the secession crisis. The South Carolinians stagger and stagger and stagger about whether they dare do it. And once they do it, there is no stopping them.
And there's this passion that overtakes them. As you say, there's no stopping. There are so many interesting things in this book. I liked very much the way you summed up the situation in the West when both sides are arguing whether slavery should be allowed into the territories, whether popular sovereignty should determine the fate of slavery. And as you paraphrase it, the North is saying to the South in so many words, your institution of slavery is foul, and we will not allow it to come into the Western territories. And the South, especially through the Dred Scott decision, is saying your behavior, the language that Charles Sumner uses, your instigation of our slaves is dangerous and vile and ungentlemanly, and therefore you shall have nothing more to say about our institution in the West or anywhere. And the two sides just cannot compromise at that point. They have such negative views of one another, neither of which is about the benefit of the slaves.
Exactly, and neither of it necessarily has to do with whether slavery is actually going to go into any territories, and neither of it necessarily has anything practical to do. It has to do with whether you're a scumball and whether I'm a scumball.
And there were only 200 slaves in Kansas.
Well, that's right.
That fascinated me. Only 200 slaves in bleeding Kansas. It's all fought on principle.
There are only 200 slaves there, but the whole principle is: does the South have as morally legitimate a right to be in there as Northerners do? Are Southerners as good as Northerners? And the whole argument easily dissolves into a question of who's a filthier person, you or me?
Yes, and there's no easy way to resolve that, no graceful way to compromise that kind of argument.
Once you get to that point, you're pretty close to a civil war.
Now, one question I absolutely have to ask about is your conception of the role of the slave in all this. You point out the role of the slaves is enormous, but largely undocumented.
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. The most important mode of slave resistance, in my judgment, is not revolting. You have almost no serious slave revolt in North America after Nat Turner's revolt in 1832. We think of when slaves revolt, when slaves resist, they should revolt. But actually, the successful form of resistance is running away. And that there's quite a bit of, especially in that border South, especially in that white belt area. And any time a slave runs away, he raises moral questions about the master. He's saying to the master, in effect, you're scum, and I will not be part of your regime. And when a Northerner helps a slave escape, he is saying, in effect, to the Southerner, you're scum, and I will help your slave escape. And also, the slave owner is losing an expensive slave. And so the fugitive slave issue becomes a very important issue, especially in that precarious border area. And who is it who creates that fugitive slave issue? It's these fugitive slaves. Without the fugitive slaves, you wouldn't have a fugitive slave law and a fugitive slave controversy. And without the fugitive slaves, you wouldn't have a Kansas-Nebraska controversy. And as far as I'm concerned, Jerry, I don't know if you agree with this, without the fugitive slaves, the whole Civil War could have gone a different way, because so many blacks ran the Union Army ranks and entered the Union Army and became a mighty force, what Lincoln called his sable arm. So Southerners have blacks have this enormous effect on Southern politics and on the military outcome of the war.
They also have a subtle effect that you talk about. You use the term cuffy, which was a derogatory, sort of generalized term for a black person, and you use it to point out the caricature of the African in the white Southern mind as someone who cannot be trusted, because the slaves are supposed to love you, the master. You've told them to, you've ordered them to, you've whipped them into it, and they say they do, but you know they can't really mean it because you're forcing it out of them. And so there's a sense that since you can't really trust your own slaves, maybe you really can't trust anybody.
That's a very discerning reading of what I'm trying to do. You can't trust the slaves. You can't trust the non-slaveholders. You can't trust the Yankees. You can't trust anybody who's playing a role, who's acting. And it's a very, very suspicious culture that the South has, and then that suspicion, that tendency to fly off into thinking that there's going to be trouble from all these people who are pretending, is a very important psychological dimension of this whole affair, I think.
Well, Bill, the music playing tells us we're at the end of our hour. I wish we had another one, because this book is really a fascinating one, and I would love to hear more about it from you. But listeners, you do not want to miss The Road to Disunion, Volume 2 by William W. Freeling. It will entertain you, if that's the right word, through its pictures of these fascinating characters. It will challenge you to rethink a lot you think you know about the coming of the Civil War. Everyone in the field will be talking about this book for a while, I think. Bill, I'm glad we got the chance to talk today.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you and a great pleasure being on your show, and your listeners are lucky they get to hear you every week. Well,
it's lucky for me that I get to read these books and talk to interesting people myself. And listeners, it's lucky that you're here from my point of view. I appreciate it. Thank you for listening to Civil War Talk Radio.